Hi guys, here we are at chapter 51. We're talking about animal behavior now that we have moved away from the specifics of body systems or all the way down to the cellular level. Now we're moving out to the larger overall ecology type view of biology, and we have talked a little bit about ecology and biomes and habitats, and now we're going to look at animal behavior, which is a pretty fascinating topic and a pretty fascinating chapter, I thought. So this animal behavior that we're going to look at talks about everything from what's important to animals to survive. Of course, that would be reproduction and escaping from predators and finding a place to live and food to eat, things of that nature, of course. But it also goes all the way up into the social structures and the various sorts of hierarchy that we see even in the human species. Some of our more advanced social structures, laws and government and religions and things of that nature can really all be kind of related back in some ways to some of the animal behavior information we're going to take a look at in chapter 51. So I find it a pretty fascinating topic. So we're going to get started right here with an overview of the how and why of animal activity, and we'll get started on this chapter. In the textbook they show this fiddler crab, this male fiddler crab, who has some pretty large differences. Most animals tend to be fairly uniform, left to right, that type of thing, but obviously you can see this guy, he's got his right claw, which is enormous compared to the rest of his body, and his left claw, and it talks about the way they behave. You notice he has a little burrow there in the sand, and if you get too close to his burrow, or if another crab gets too close to his burrow, he will wave that large claw around kind of menacingly. So him waving that claw around is a behavior in response to certain conditions around him. Maybe it's to attract a mate, or to ward off his enemy, or to scare away perhaps other male crabs. We're going to look at the hows and whys of this type of activity. So this fiddler crab, he has a small claw that he usually uses to find food with and eat with, but then he has that big, large, showy claw as well. And the question is, why do these crabs engage in this whole claw waving behavior? Why does he have this one massive claw, and what is he doing there when he waves it around and kind of looks like he's trying to scare us off? So claw waving is used, of course, for a couple different reasons in these crabs: to repel other males from their territory, to attract females. You're going to find out that a lot of animal behavior has to do with these two things: food and sex, food and sex. Those are the two primary drives of survival, and so that's what natural selection tends to choose for, not only in physiology and body and anatomy, but also in behavior. Just a quick definition of the word behavior: it's basically the nervous system's response to a particular stimulus, and then of course that response is carried out by the muscular system or the hormonal system. So that could be anything that you might think of, from say a mockingbird singing a song, to a animal releasing a particular scent to mark its territory, to kind of ward off enemies, or to ward off competitors, waving a claw around in the case of this crab. We're going to find out that behavior and physiology shape each other. So the physical anatomy and physiology of a creature and its behavior tend to tie in together, and one of them actually has a bearing on the other. And of course we're also going to find out that behavior is subject to natural selection, just like the physical components of an animal's body is as well. In the Chapter 51 Notes folder, I'll upload a number of these little clips, but there are a number of little video clips here. Some of them we might have seen before because we've discussed some of this in other chapters. Albatross courtship ritual, the blue-footed booby found on the Galapagos Islands, giraffe courtship rituals. So you're going to find out a lot of what we're going to talk about in this chapter relates to courtship or reproduction, and then of course finding food and maintaining food supplies and escaping predators, the basic things that animals need to do to survive. But we will also kind of extrapolate some of that information out to more complex behaviors, particularly in primates like chimpanzees and of course humans as well. Let's get started with Concept 51.1. It says discrete sensory inputs can stimulate both simple and complex behaviors. And so we're going to talk about kind of the range of different behaviors or responses. We're going to start with the most simple, and we're going to move our way up to the more complex behaviors and the more complex responses. As we talk about these behaviors, we're going to keep in mind 4 questions that were first proposed or posed by a Dutch scientist, Nico Tinbergen, or Tinbergen. Nico Timbergen identified 4 questions that we should ask, or that you should ask when investigating animal behavior. And the first 1 and 2 have to kind of do with the how or the what, and the next 2 have to do more with why. So question number 1 is, what stimulus elicits the behavior, and what physiological mechanisms mediate the response? Question number 2 is, how does the animal's experience during growth and development influence the response? Question number 3 was, how does the behavior aid survival and reproduction? And number 4 is, what is the behavior's evolutionary history? So again, the first 2 questions are more about the how of the behavior, and the last 2 questions are more considering the why of the behavior. And we're also going to discuss, and overall this chapter is about behavioral ecology. That's the study of the ecological and evolutionary basis for animal behavior. So when you look at a particular behavior of an animal, you're trying to figure out, why does it do this, how does it do this, what is the stimulus that causes this, and how did this behavior develop, or how did it come about through the evolutionary process? And that all together, when you look at that, that's called behavioral ecology. Again, the textbook mentions how we're going to focus on the how and why. Another way to speak of this is what we call proximate and ultimate causation. Behavioral ecology looks at proximate causation, which addresses the how of the behavior, how a behavior occurs or how it's modified, and that would be kind of looking at questions number 1 and 2 here. What stimulus causes it? What's the mechanism for the response? How does the animal's experience change or influence its response? And then the other portion is the ultimate causation, and the ultimate causation addresses the why. So in the context of natural selection, you would say, why does the creature do this? How does it benefit the creature in some way? How does it aid its survival or help it find a mate? And then of course, what is the evolutionary history? How did this develop? How did this come about? Why do we see it now in this creature? How did we get to this point? Basically is what we're asking about. So behavioral ecology tries to address both of those things, the proximate and the ultimate causation. We're going to start out with some of the most simplistic behaviors, the ones that are the least complex, and probably the most simple behaviors are what we call fixed action patterns. A fixed action pattern is a sequence of what we call unlearned innate behaviors directly linked to a simple particular stimulus. In other words, it's pretty much something that the creature doesn't have a lot of control over. They are born with this particular pattern or born with this behavior, and it happens sort of automatically. You might consider this fixed action pattern sort of like a reflex behavior. It's usually unchangeable throughout their life, and they seem to have little control over this behavior. Once initiated, it's usually carried to its completion, and a fixed action pattern is triggered by a particular stimulus, a particular cue known as a sign stimulus. A great example of this is in one of the animals that Timbergen was studying. He was studying a particular type of little fish called a male stickleback fish, and the male sticklebacks have a red belly on the underside of their body, on the ventral side of their body. And what he noticed was he had a little aquarium of these male stickleback fish, and he noticed that the aquarium was near a lab window, and when a red truck would pass by the lab window, that suddenly the male stickleback fish would start to behave aggressively. So he began to wonder, what is causing these fish to behave aggressively when this red truck passes? And what he found was, in the male stickleback fish, this red color is the stimulus. It's the sign stimulus for aggressive behavior. So in these fish, the stimulus for attack behavior is the red underside of an intruder, of another male stickleback fish. And so what he did was a cool little experiment to show that it was the red color that was the stimulus itself. He created a number of little models to kind of antagonize his little male stickleback fish. The first model he created was this one at the top that you see. Very realistic, looks exactly like the male stickleback fish, except it lacks the red underbelly of the actual fish. When presented with this model, the male sticklebacks showed no response. Even though it is a great model of a male stickleback, it looks like a male stickleback fish in every way except for the red, they showed no response. When he presented them with other model shapes that do not look very much like a fish at all, but they did have the red underbelly, there was a strong response by the male stickleback fish. So what this tells you is, it's not really the shape of the male fish or anything else that is the cue or the trigger. It's that red underbelly that's causing the response. So when those red trucks pass by, the fish see the red. That immediately causes this innate automatic reflexive response. This is his fixed action pattern, and they begin to get aggressive. So it really didn't matter if he presented them with a fish model that didn't look much like a fish at all. If they had that red underbelly, it would provoke that fixed action pattern. So this is a very good example of a simplistic behavior that's almost pretty much beyond the control of the creature. It's a reflexive type of behavior that is innate and is basically very simple in its both its cue and its response. Another fairly simplistic behavior, sort of a fixed action response behavior, is migration. And this of course goes off various environmental cues. So various environmental cues like the amount of sunlight and the temperature and things of that nature can trigger a response as well. In this case, a movement in one particular direction, say toward the south or toward the north, this migration pattern that we see annually for many different kinds of birds. Migration is this regular long distance change in location, generally flying south, if we're talking about the northern hemisphere, flying south for the winter and north for the summer months. Animals we have found can orientate themselves in a number of ways. They use a variety of ways to kind of map out the location of where they need to go. They can use the position of the sun and their own internal circadian rhythm, their own circadian clock that kind of helps them navigate by the sun, but they can also use other things. They can use the position of the North Star. There are some creatures that fly primarily at night, and they can use the position of various stars. They can even use the Earth's magnetic field, and it's been found that many birds and other animals are sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field, and that might be what allows them to navigate, say, on cloudy or stormy days and nights when they don't have their usual sun or stars cues to go by. So migration is basically a fixed action response, kind of a fixed pattern that is brought upon by various environmental cues. And so these environmental cues are what trigger this particular response. Some of these simple animal behaviors are triggered by a particular cue, like the male stickleback. His aggressive behavior was triggered by the red color that he saw. But a lot of these behaviors are also triggered by various patterns or rhythms in the environment around them. Oftentimes it's by the animal's circadian rhythm, the basic day and night sort of pattern of light and dark, 24-hour cycle of rest and activity. But some of these patterns are over a longer period of time, like migration and reproduction. Those tend to go on a more annual or seasonal basis, what we call a circannual rhythm. So daylight and darkness are common seasonal clues or cues, because it tends to get darker in the winter where there's less sunlight hours, and then lighter in the summer where there's more sunlight hours. That's one of the cues that a lot of times animal behavior is keyed off of. And then some are linked to, say, lunar cycles or tidal cycles and that type of thing. So the mating and courtship of the fiddler crab that we were mentioning is oftentimes related around the lunar cycle, and that makes sense because they live in these shallow areas, these tidal floodplains, and the lunar cycle affects the tides, so their reproductive cycle is affected by the tides, which is of course affected by the moon. So they go off of sort of a lunar cycle type of system. So oftentimes these behaviors are rhythmical. The creatures will migrate every spring or every fall or as the daylight hours get longer, and of course that's affected by the environmental cues that they receive around them. We're going to take a quick break right there just so we don't make the videos too long. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about animal signals and communication. When we talk about animals communicating to each other, of course they may not have advanced language and pictures and words and letters the way that we do, but of course animals do have various ways of communicating with each other. Even simple creatures like insects have sometimes very complex methods for communicating with each other. So when we come back, we're going to take a look at that. We're going to talk about signal and response and communication between animals. So come right back in just a second.